Great. Well, again, thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Robert Hayes. I'm the Community Outreach Librarian and Head of Technical Services at the Tewksbury Public Library. I want to thank, there's about 25 libraries who are partnering with us tonight, and I will thank them all later on in the chat, but do want to certainly make mention of their support. We are in Zoom webinar mode tonight. Michelle and I cannot see you or hear you. If you have a question for Michelle, please type it into the Q&A box. If you have a comment for Michelle, please type it into the chat, and we'll try to address as many questions and comments as we can before we wrap up tonight. To set expectations, I anticipate this program lasting approximately an hour. Michelle has some brief remarks. Then I have some prepared questions for her. And then, as I said, we'll take audience questions and comments. For those who are watching live on Zoom, please be on the lookout for an email from me tomorrow morning with a link to a feedback survey. Please take 60 seconds and fill that out. Let us know what you thought of Michelle's talk, and let us know what you'd like to see for future talks. And then in addition, there'll be a link to the recording in that email as well. So please share that with anyone in your life who you feel may benefit from watching tonight's event. All right, so tonight, author Michelle Bowdler is here with us. She was recently recognized by the Massachusetts Center for the Book as one of Massachusetts must-read authors of the year. She's here to discuss her critically acclaimed book, Is Rape a Crime? A Memoir, an Investigation, and a Manifesto. So Michelle is the Executive Director of Health and Wellness at Tufts University, and after graduating from the Harvard School of Public Health, has worked on social justice issues related to rape for over a decade. Is Rape a Crime is her first book. She is a recipient of a 2017 Barbara Deming Memorial Award and has been a fellow at Ragdale and the McDowell Colony. Michelle's writing has been published in the New York Times, and her essays, Eventually You Tell Your Kids and Babalog, were nominated for Pushcart Prizes. And specific to her first book here, Is Rape a Crime, critically acclaimed, was longlisted for the 2020 National Book Award for Nonfiction, so doesn't get much bigger than that. Was also named Times Magazine's 100 Must-Read Books of 2020. Publishers Weekly also named it to its best books of 2020. New York Times recognized it as one of their new and noteworthy audiobooks. And among other things, it received star reviews in Publishers Weekly and Shelf Awareness. The bottom line is it is a fantastic, powerful book. And I was able to read it recently and can't say enough good things about it. So for everyone who's here live on Zoom and on Facebook, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Michelle for joining us here this evening. And Michelle, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you so much, Robert. That was so generous of you. And it's really fun seeing where everybody is from in the chat. It's so exciting for me to be part of a library talk and all the so many libraries in Massachusetts. And I also see that I have some new friends and old friends listening in. It's really, really wonderful. So thank you. I wanted to tell you a little bit about me and about this book. If you haven't read it yet, and it will help, I think, our conversation go well when Robert comes back on stage, back on Zoom. And excuse me, and I also wanted to say that there's a couple of things. One is that when we're at the Q&A part of this talk, there's no question you can't ask me. We can talk about the book, we can talk about writing, we can talk about publishing your first book in your 50s, and we can talk about libraries. We can talk about anything you want to talk about. And I don't assume that everyone has read the book who's listening in, so I do want to give you a little bit of context. This book was a long time coming, and it is a memoir about my life, and also there's an investigation of a cold case that is discussed in the book, and the manifesto is a call to action. So in 1980, and if, because you're from Massachusetts, I think this story is especially vital, because this is really a Boston story about the Boston Sexual Assault Unit, and particularly how our city and state have dealt with sex crimes, and how our crime lab has done over many years, and some of the problems there. All of that is talked about. But in 1984, there was a series of home invasions and break-ins that occurred in Boston. And they were occurring in all these different districts: Allston, Brighton, Brookline. And our house was invaded on June 21st, first night of summer, 1984. And it was the 7th of a series. It was, I think, one of the last that made it into the Boston Globe. It was front page on the Metro section. It was in the news because people were scared. And a week later, Mayor Flynn announced that the Boston Sexual Assault Unit was going to be formed. And the goal of the unit was to look at all these separate police departments that were dealing with these break-ins and bring them together to try to see if there were any patterns in these break-ins to solve the case. And I actually didn't know any of this for about 25 years. I didn't realize that the Boston Sexual Assault Unit had been formed in many ways to respond to my very case. And so the book really is an effort to show the impact of trauma on individuals, which is something that isn't always talked about or well understood, and juxtapose that with the lack of response or the minimization of response by law enforcement and by society at large and by legislation that often lets rape survivors and trauma survivors down. And one of the things that I talk about in the book, that's something that is almost so shocking that people can't believe it, is that what got me interested in even looking at my cold case was that I started reading in 2007, 2008 about how there were hundreds of thousands of untested rape kits, which basically means uninvestigated rapes, in warehouses and crime labs around the country, dating back decades. And when this information started to come to light, because a human rights group made sure that it got into the media, cities started testing these old rape kits, and they found serial perpetrators that, had they investigated the rape cases when they occurred, they might have prevented, or they would have prevented 5 to 10 cases that didn't need to happen. And so the book really both examines my life, trying to find a way to move forward, and actually building a life that I'm really proud of and happy with now, with the ways in which law enforcement and the criminal justice system has not really supported this crime, which is a felony, and yet is treated like it's not, like it's a misdemeanor. And so in the book, I do become active in some national work with the Department of Justice, and trying to make a difference in the way that rape victims are how their cases are investigated. And I eventually go back to figure out, to see what happened in my own cold case. And that is the investigation. And what I find is not good in terms of what did or didn't happen in my case. And the manifesto is really a call to action. I talk about how you can't make change unless you really look at the root cause of why something is occurring, and really look at the ways in which this crime, which by and large affects women, children, LGBTQ people and trans and non-binary people at higher rates than straight and cisgendered people, and that people of color also have are impacted at higher rates than white people. And so all of that's addressed in the book, and that's the summary. So I really also want to say, and Robert, thanks for coming back on. I want to say that this year has been incredible, talking to people, answering questions, and talking to people who've read the book and have appreciated its message. And so thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. And I'm happy to start with questions with you, Robert, and then we'll go from there.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Michelle, as I said, for being here and for giving us a synopsis of your book. So as I said, as I was telling you before we started the call, I've pretty much read your book in the last 24 hours. So it's all still fresh in my mind. And I took really good notes. So wanted to start at the beginning, even before the beginning in the introduction, when you lay out some really startling statistics. You mentioned that 1 in 6 US women will experience rape or attempted rape in their lifetime. And then you note that the Rape and Incest National Network, RAINN, R-A-I-N-N, estimates that 230 out of 1,000 rapes are reported. Of those, 46 lead to arrest, 9 to prosecution, and 5 to felony conviction. So only 4% of all reported rape cases see the inside of a courtroom, translating into 1% of every 1,000 rapes committed. And I'm wondering if you could react to those statistics that you shared.
Yeah, they are pretty brutal. And, you know, I think that it's hard to, you know, it's hard to understand how those numbers can be true, and that rape is, if we think about rape and sexual assault as violent felonies, and the thing that I often say in these talks is that many of them could qualify as attempted murder, and yet we continue to allow people to describe them as he said, she said, which is ridiculous, or a misunderstanding, or unreliable narrator, or you don't want to ruin someone's life, as opposed to understanding the real impact of this devastating violence and what it does to people for years. And so while we are a country, we are a nation that incarcerates a larger percentage of our citizens than any other country in the world. And yet we have this felony, which is uniquely uninvestigated and not taken seriously in a way that is devastating and is dangerous, because we also know that most perpetrators are serial perpetrators. So that alone is something that I just really want to bring to the conversation, and, you know, ask people to understand the data that we're looking at, and to think about why it is that we allow this. And, you know, I say in the very beginning of the book that what other thing in our world is treated both as an international weapon of war, and yet is also used as a way to make a sure laugh or a joke in a comedy club? Like, was there anything else like that in our society? I don't think so.
So the book begins, chapter 1, sort of the immediate aftermath of your, well, I should say rape, of your rape. I shouldn't say incidents or assault. I should,
Okay.
as I've learned from your book, you should call it what it is. So, you know, you're in the back of the police car. We travel with you to the hospital. You get the rape kit exam. And so I believe in chapter 2, I wanted to throw another statistic out to you and ask you to respond. You write that some people never report, some never tell their family or friends. The reasons are complex and vary depending on the survivor's age, economic situation, internalized self-blame and shame, and whether it is safe to report the crime at the most basic level. You say that approximately 80% of victims know their attacker, which can complicate reporting. And then you also touch on why it takes some rape survivors so long to report. So can you speak to why some rape survivors, never share their experience, and why others take so long, quote unquote, to report?
So there is a statistic, and I'm not going to get it completely right, but that there is a large percentage of people who experience sexual assault under the age of, I think it's 14. And
Not to interrupt you, Michelle, I had, it's 30%
okay.
Are between ages 11 and 17.
Yeah. Yes. And so if you're in a home where the person who has assaulted you is the person who makes the family's paycheck, often, even when a perpetrator is known, there is a threat that if you tell or if you report, harm will come to people that you love. And also in the criminal justice system, which is hard for anybody to think about reporting. But as a young person, they are often uniquely considered difficult as witnesses because they're vulnerable and they're scared. And so the very thing that makes them vulnerable to assault is paradoxically the thing that makes DAs and law enforcement turn away from wanting to pursue cases. Also, they may be somebody who in the community is widely admired, whether they're coaches, clergy, teachers, neighbors. And it's that old adage of, oh my gosh, I thought they were the nicest person in the world, which really means nothing, because it doesn't matter if they're nice to you. What matters is what's happening in a situation like that. And so I also think that we need to think about ways to give people support that doesn't necessarily rely on the criminal justice system, and we think broadly about other ways to support people.
So you get the you go to the hospital, you come back, you do the initial interview, you get fingerprinted, so you do report your case. In chapter 3, you sort of throughout the book, but starting in chapter 1, but more so beginning in chapter 3, you talk about the interactions that you're having with the police throughout or maybe lack of interaction you're having with the police during this whole process. And on page 49 and page 50, you offer some advice to the police. You write that the problems begin when police see the victim first as a case rather than as a human being who's been violently harmed during a felony. The police know the same stats that the rest of us do, that sexual assault cases rarely make it to court, and when they do, they rarely result in conviction. So given that, many police officers may consider their efforts to investigate rape futile, and it's not surprising how many rape reports are dismissed. So I was wondering if you could talk about your initial interview and your fingerprinting experience and sort of your initial interactions with the police.
Yes, I thank you for that question. And I just want to add before I answer that, I work at a university, and I remember probably 10 or 12 years ago now at this point, we were looking at our sexual assault policy, which desperately needed updating and improving. It was not trauma informed at all, and it needed to be fixed. And I remember we were talking to somebody who was at another school, who had recently updated theirs. And they said, you know, we have changed the way we talk to people. And we do our best to do a full investigation. And at the end, even when people don't get the outcome that they want, this one dean said to me, I've had people say, you know, that process was really humane. And I understand that, you know, whatever it was, there wasn't enough evidence to do this or that, like whatever the outcome was. They said, but I feel okay because I feel like you listened, cared, and did your best to support me and get to the truth. And I'll never forget that if we frame cases as, you know, if we teach law enforcement that their goal is to have a winning record, and DAs, I see it on crime shows all the time. Well, we can't prosecute that because we can't possibly win because this could happen and that could happen. And for rape victims, it's not about winning or losing. I mean, they are trying to get some help and support for an overwhelmingly traumatic event. And what we don't want is for the people that they're going to for help to make it worse at the most basic level. And the story that you're talking about, you know, it's funny because what happened when I first walked into this Boston police station, it was less than 24 hours after these two men had broken into my home, and I hadn't slept, and I was very disassociated. Like I wasn't even sure I was alive at the time. It was just very destabilizing. And yet during that moment, and this is a hard thing for people to hear. It's not so hard for me to say it, but it's hard for people to hear. I gave my fingerprints because they didn't have good DNA then, and so they had to use fingerprints to see if they could help figure out which ones were mine and which ones were the assailants. And so I felt like I was a criminal, you know, turning my fingers over on the ink and leaving my fingerprints behind. And this officer, there was either a dog in the police station or a police dog or something, and it was barking and barking and barking. And all these people were like, be quiet, shut that dog up. And finally, this officer looked at me and he said, and this is the thing about being confused, this is as clear to me as if it happened yesterday. And he said, boy, just like a woman, that dog can't keep its mouth shut. And in that moment, I was like, that's it. If this person could make a joke to somebody who had just gone through what I had gone through, I felt like, okay, so nothing's going to happen with this. And it turned out I was right. And there was nobody there to say, you know, you shouldn't say that, or I'm really sorry, he's a jerk, or anything. It was just said and acquiesced to. And, you know, that was the start of my experience with the police.
And then 2 months later, when you're about to move and you're concerned that the police won't be able to, you know, track you, to get in contact with you, you call and ask for an update. And I believe the quote is, didn't I say I'd call you if we knew anything? And I haven't called you, so that means I don't have anything. So,
right.
You know, and it gets worse from there, really. So now, so then you talk about, you know, a support system. You have a bit of a support system in place. You have your friends, your roommates, and your guardian angel. I think his name was Isaac. But you talk about, and sort of something you don't really necessarily consider, but you talk about having to inform your family members that you've been raped. And you have your older sister tell your mom, so your father's passed at this point, you have your sister tell your mom and your aunts, and then your mom is kind of torn as to, I guess she gets some bad advice, but she decides not to initially come and visit you. You want to talk about how all that transpired and how difficult that must have been?
Yeah. I think that one of the things that can be really confusing when somebody who's used to being a caretaker suddenly, in the blink of an evening, of a night, of a catastrophe, suddenly needs some caretaking. It can be really hard for them. It could be awkward. They don't want to be that person. In fact, you'll notice I'm not using the first person. They don't want to be that person who needs help. And, this was 1984. It wouldn't have been easy for my family to even figure out, like, where would they stay. There were no Airbnbs. I couldn't imagine them in a hotel. I had just left my apartment and was staying with a friend who had one little extra bedroom down the hall. So, I was thankfully being taken care of, but I didn't feel like there was any room to impose other people. I felt like I needed everything from everybody. And so I told my mom not to come because I didn't feel like I could help her. I couldn't take care of her so that she could take care of me. I didn't feel like I could help her find a place to stay or really do much of anything except just move forward in the world one step at a time. And it wasn't because I didn't want her there, but in that moment, that was what I said. And I think I didn't correct it soon enough. So I wound up just going to visit her about 2 months later.
You also mentioned that one of your uncles wanted to come up to Boston and kill the two perpetrators. We should mention the perpetrators, got away, so they were not arrested.
No.
And so you note that victims of violence generally do not desire additional violence to feel better,
Right.
and so you really weren't engaged in any sort of revenge fantasies. So then you talk a bit about, well, actually, let me ask you this. You discussed it later on, but you mentioned it first on page 54. It's important for men to work to understand the impact of sexual assault, but too often their efforts are superficial. And you talk about the walk a mile in her shoes, for like men walk around in high heels to sort of, in solidarity to show support. And you mentioned former President Obama's "It's on Us" campaign.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what men should be doing to sort of understand the impact of sexual assault?
Yeah, one of the things that I want to say irritates me is like when politicians say things like, you have a sister, you have a daughter, you have a wife, if they do. So you should care about this. And people don't say, we should care about murder, and because we should care about harm to people because we care about people. And a good number of victims are men and male identified people who often do not talk about it because it's supposed to be something somehow that they shouldn't talk about when they should. And so the assumption is that it happens uniquely to women, not true. And that what men's role is to protect or to, go kill the perpetrator or somehow show a show of machoism as opposed to the same thing that I would want from anybody. I'm really sorry this happened. What do you need? How can I help? Do you want to talk? I'll just listen. What do you need from me? It just at a simple level, like you would respond to any human who had a loss or a tragedy befall them or a trauma. It shouldn't be different than that. But what I don't think, and the thing also with the "It's on Us" campaign, it was a lot of that, it's on us. Like it was on the men to somehow do something. And I just don't care for that. And I do think the Obama administration did a lot of good things in terms of trying to change some things on college campuses. But I think that we have to do more than just have slogans and put on red high heels and walk a mile. Just for the record, I never wear high heels, and I don't think of it as a symbol of womanhood, and I don't think other people should either. So.
Moving on with your story. Well, let me just say that from a writing standpoint, and I don't know if you meant to do this, but I just got angrier and angrier as I went. And you don't actually describe the rape until the 7th chapter. So I wasn't even sure necessarily if you were gonna include that. So it was interesting the way you kind of jumped around in time a bit. So you dedicate a chapter to the repercussions that your rape has with your career, and you talk about how you returned to work 1 week later after your rape. You felt overwhelmed, work was piling up, your boss was a complete jerk to you, tells you that you're behind schedule. You ask for a month's leave, to sort of, get in a better headspace, and he refuses. And then you're sort of forced to give your notice. And you write, the trajectory of my career changed inalterably, and for the remainder of my work life when I walked out of that building, leaving my magazine job behind. For the next 4 years, work would be a thing I did to survive, a thing I did when I could manage. And I think you talk about working as a secretary for a temp agency. And then you go on and give a really startling statistic. The estimated lifetime cost of being raped is over $120,000 per victim, a cumulative economic burden of nearly $3.1 trillion in the US. That includes things like time off, diminished performance, job loss, inability to work. Can you talk about your own experience of having to essentially quit your job because you weren't, being supported there, and how other survivors of rape, have difficulty, for example, collecting from the victim compensation fund?
Yeah, I will, and I'll also say that writing this book has felt like a return for me. I had been an English major. I love to write. I love to read. And I had and I was working for a magazine when I was attacked. And I had thought, well, maybe I'll work in publishing. Maybe I'll get my MFA. And by the time I felt like I had my feet under me again, I had gone into a different direction. And there's something about having gotten back to writing and writing this book, and the very generous things you said about it, and having it be nominated for the National Book Award. I feel like, what, this has now sort of gone full circle in terms of making meaning for me. The other thing I want to say, and I'm going to answer your question, but the other thing I want to say is that this book, it was really important to me, is that while you're getting angry, that you're also seeing me slowly build a life. I meet a wonderful woman who I'm still with. We raise 2 gorgeous, joy-filled children. Eventually, I make my way back to school and I get a graduate degree at Harvard. I get a great job that I love and care about. My life recalibrates, and both of those things can be true. That this series of issues that I now have studied and want other people to learn about can be important for people to understand, and also to know that victims of violence can have dignity and joy and hope. And if I couldn't have done that in the book, I would have felt like the book failed. So I hope that also comes through. And I'm not sure if I remember to answer your question, Robert. Did I answer it?
That's okay. I babble. So the question was actually about how the rape affected your employment.
Oh, yeah.
And how, in general, how sexual assaults affect the survivors when it comes to their employment.
Okay, good. I'm glad you asked that, because the book is filled with research. And I have to say that a lot of things that I thought were unique to me and that I blamed myself for and I felt ashamed of, as I wrote this book, I found out how common they were. Job loss, feeling underemployed, having to leave your apartment, having trouble in relationships, having trouble trusting people, blaming yourself for the ways in which you're suffering. I thought those were just me. And in writing the book and then in putting the research in the book, there's a lot in there that's like, this is really common. And job loss and displacement are actually really common. People can't work, they can't think, and they need a change. And there is something called the Victims' Compensation Fund, which, because of the Violence Against Women Act that was first brought into law in 1992, it's a required benefit for victims of sexual violence in all 50 states. But unfortunately, most states require that you report to law enforcement to be eligible for victims' compensation. And it seems to me that if you have a doctor that you've disclosed to or a therapist, that should be sufficient, because a lot of people need help with rent for a couple of months. Some people need to leave their home if their abuser is at home. And I'd like us to be using more creative solutions than just knowing that the solutions that we have are broken. So.
Yeah, in the subsequent chapter, you do introduce us to Mary, and you sort of, and you also talk about how you sort of somewhat struggle to have relationships, whether you should get back, you reconnect with your ex or not, and things like that. And but no, it's certainly not all bad. I don't want to. There's certainly a lot of bright spots as well. And you are correct. You're on both paths at the same time.
Good.
So in the interest of time, I'll jump to the second section of the book, okay, which begins with the Boston Globe article that you referenced. Mm-hmm. The headline reads, "Crime Lab neglected 16,000 cases. Evidence was never analyzed. Probe finds." And so that included 6,500 sexual assaults that were never analyzed by the state police crime lab. The newspaper called it a crisis. You were wondering if your rape kit was ever tested, why you never heard from the police. And what was particularly frustrating was that the officials sort of involved in overseeing this was minimizing the Boston Globe's report. They were saying that the samples that weren't tested were from things like suicides and drug overdoses and criminal cases where there were guilty pleas. And so the DNA and biological evidence wasn't necessary. But as you pointed out prior, a lot of rapists are serial rapists who so anyway, can you talk a bit about, once again, about, reading that article and what were some of your initial thoughts and how did you react?
Yeah, I mean, when you think about other crimes, I don't think that the police say, well, we'll test the evidence and we'll see what these hair samples are and we'll do this and we'll do that if we have a suspect. You investigate to try to identify people who might be implicated. And with rape, there's a term that I use in the book that I've heard a lot of other people use, which is, in fact, somebody's body becomes a crime scene. And so to decide not to test DNA, you're losing the possibility of being able to connect this violent felony with others. And I got to know a lot of survivors in the advocacy work that I do. And there was one woman in particular who was assaulted in Los Angeles, and she They waited 13 years to test her rape kit. And when they did, they matched it to a long distance truck driver who had raped people all through the country. And the only reason his DNA, the only reason his identity was discovered, you can have matches to DNA and still not know who the perpetrator is. But he had assaulted his wife in Indiana. And in Indiana, in this particular city, they had a law where it doesn't matter if you know the perpetrator, you still need to test the rape kit. And so 13 years later, I'm not sure why it took 13 years. Like, you have to ask yourself that. Why wasn't her rape kit tested at the time? But her rapist was identified, and this person was extremely dangerous. So, so that story in the Boston Globe, and I talk a lot about what was happening in the Boston Globe archives. So if you're interested in history, there's a lot in there. But that story was what got me interested in the advocacy work that I still do now, and in also going back and say, if it says these cases go back to the 1980s, is that why I never heard from this detective? And it leads to the investigation that is chronicled in the book.
So that Boston Globe article was a game changer. The other game changer you talk about is the birth of your two kids.
Yeah.
It felt like a minor miracle that I could let myself take the risk of caring this much again, of chancing something so precious and so fragile. If it was this ability to care once again and love deeply that drove me to look into my cold case. I wanted a different world for my children, and most of all, to be a parent who showed them that injustice and the harm it does cannot stand, that self-regard can help you find what you once believed was lost. So can you talk about the effect your children had on your drive to find out what happened to your case?
Yeah, there's something about having kids that brings up a vulnerability for parents that I think is sometimes shocking to us. It's like, wow, you feel like your heart's beating out of your chest all the time because you feel so responsible for their safety. And when you're somebody whose safety has been so violated, and I had periods where I still struggled and would be triggered by something that would take me a long time to recoup from, even, decades later. And after I read that article, and as the kids grew, I felt like if I couldn't do it for myself, I wanted to do it for the way that I loved them. I wanted to find a way to speak out. I wanted to find a way to find my own self-regard. And even if the answer was something I wasn't going to like, that I cared enough to at least look, and I didn't have to be ashamed. I could ask for answers and not feel like it was a bother. And I'm really glad that I did. And and the other thing that's in the book, and that is telling my kids and their reaction. And I had an essay that was published, and I think you read the title, Eventually You Tell Your Kids. And that was what it was about, was sort of what it means to have trauma. And when your kid, how kids always say to you, tell me a story. Tell me a story about when you were little. Tell me a story about when you were in college. And when you have trauma in your history, it's really hard to know when you're going to tell them, and when it feels like you're withholding something, that can feel like you're not bringing your whole self to your relationship. And of course, that's not appropriate when they're little, but at some point it feels like you need to tell them. And eventually we did. And I was glad. I was really, really glad that we did.
So as you said, you're doing better, but you're still triggered by certain events, triggered usually by the anniversary of the attack in June. And triggered, you had to go into surgery, so you had to go back to Beth Israel after so many years, and you suffered PTSD, sought therapy. You got a therapist for your traumatic response. All right, so we're about halfway through the book, and I've run out of time here. So a couple more questions for you, then we'll go to the audience.
Okay.
But you do spend half a chapter talking about Clarence Thomas and the Anita Hill hearing. And I wanted to read a quote. The need to minimize rape is all too prevalent, and a false equivalency is drawn between the suffering of victims and perpetrators. In this world, being accused of a crime is supposedly as bad or worse than being the victim of the violence. Someone's life will be ruined if a credible accusation makes the person lose any power to which they are entitled. So can you talk about your reactions to the Clarence Thomas hearing? And you also referenced the Brett Kavanaugh hearings.
Yeah. I remember when I was reading, well, also watching, and I'm old enough to have sat and watched those hearings, and also in reading Anita Hill's book, she talks about how it was clear that she was meant to be the one who was on trial, that was a strategy. And the things that were said to her were said by, an all-white male Senate Judiciary Committee. Like, is it really so bad to talk about, women's breasts? And is it really so bad? And, are you sure you're not a scorned woman? Like all those things that they said. And I remember early in the book, I had a typo. I had at the Anita Hill hearings. And I think I was I don't remember if I was talking to her. We eventually have gotten to know each other, and which is just a huge privilege for me. And she's like, people call them the Anita Hill hearings. They were the Clarence Thomas hearings, just like you said. And yet people still think of her as being the one who was demolished, even though she kept her dignity. She did. And then had death threats after and had to leave the University of Oklahoma. I mean, it was horrible. And yet she just has kept doing the work. And that's often the case, as if, like I think Trump at one point said something like, it's a dangerous time for men in America after the Kavanaugh hearings. And it's like, how can you possibly say that? People are once in a while now being held accountable for sexual harassment, sexual assault, and you're basically saying that most of those are false accusations, which the data does not support. It does not support in the slightest. That overwhelmingly, who would go, really think about it, who would go and report the most vulnerable violation you can imagine for some other purpose than that they're looking for some help? So just saying.
Yeah, another quote that really stuck with me: rape in this country is not treated as a crime of brutal violence, but as a parlor game. His word against hers, regret sex, revenge against a scorned lover. The victim is often painted as unstable or unreliable, wanting attention or money, hoping to destroy the rapist's life, perhaps even part of a well-crafted political conspiracy to discredit the perpetrator. It might be laughable if it didn't work so much of the time. And also, you noted studies estimate that between 2% and 8% of rape claims are deemed to be either false or baseless. So only 2% to 8%. But then you go on to actually explain what police mean when they say false or baseless. Do you want to briefly touch on that? Then we'll go to some audience questions.
Yeah, sometimes they can use categories that make it sound like a claim is false or baseless when there's not enough evidence, or the person can't really testify because they're too upset or too young and their parents don't want them to, or whatever it is. They can name it under a category that dismisses the case, that makes it sound like there was a falsehood, and that is not true. And also, 2 to 8% is an estimate. I tend to think that it's much closer to the 2% than to the 8%. And even then, that's a far cry from he said, she said. So.
All right, so we'll touch on the ending of your book at the very end, the next 10 minutes or so, but let's get to audience questions. Virginia asks, some say that rape is about sex and others say it is about violence. What do you say?
it is 100% about violence, and that the way that the violence is enacted is why it's called sexual violence, but it's not an act of sex. The act of sex occurs, but it is a crime of violence.
Heidi asks, how can we shift the conversation to preventing boys and men from raping girls and women versus teaching women and girls to protect themselves?
Right. That's a great question. I was just talking to somebody about this today because I was actually talking to a male student who wanted to do a really good job for the clubs that he was in, because he was tired of going to talks where he said it feels like it's about the men, here's how you shouldn't rape, and for the women, here's how you shouldn't get assaulted. And in the work that I do, we have found on college campuses that you can't just teach people about sexual assault prevention. You have to also teach about sexual health and safer sex practices, which include consent and communication. People don't want to just sit in a room and be told what they're not supposed to do. They have to also understand what consent is, when it can't be given, that the goal of a party is to find ways that you're definitely going to have sex at the end of it, that's not a goal of the party. There are a lot of things that happen where certain freshmen girls are allowed into party that the boys aren't allowed into. We have to talk about what's happening in a way that doesn't shame or blame anybody, but that talks about how we should all be interested in prevention, and not just in the moment when somebody is at risk, but way before that, so that people really understand what consent is and what it isn't, and really not victim blaming, because people aren't raped because of what they're wearing or how much they drank or where they walked, because nobody should be assaulted. So there's nothing they can do that causes it at all.
Philomena says that she read Susan Brown Miller's book, Against Our Will, Men, Women, and Rape, decades ago. Mm-hmm. Susan argues, if Philomena remembers correctly, that rape serves a function to keep women in their place. Do you agree with Brown Miller's point? Is that why rape just is not treated as seriously as other felonies?
Well, I think that she was making a point, if I dare say, because I think she wrote a really important book, but I think that point was really made imperfectly. I do think that rape and the way it's addressed does reflect the misogyny in our world, and also the ways in which in some cultures and in too many of our lives, women are still considered men's property, that our bodies are not ours to make our own decisions about, that laws increasingly are putting women's rights to body sovereignty are at risk, that the governor of Texas can say that we don't have to worry about that abortion bill in Texas because they're going to end rape in Texas, when they have like tens of thousands of rape kits untested in his state. And so there is a part of rape that is an angry and violent act against mostly women, that I do argue in the book is intentional, and that we have to, if we want to make change, we have to have lawmakers and police officers who look more like the rest of society.
Paul asks, do you, and this is, I believe this is addressed in the very first chapter of the book. Do you remember how many specimens were collected from you during your sexual assault exam? Were you asked about specific details of the assault? The assault having occurred many years ago, I would guess only a small number of items were collected. And then Paul mentions that he's a retired forensic scientist.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Paul. What I would say is that things have changed a lot since 1984. And there's a lot of survivors that I've met who speak to forensic scientists with only the greatest respect for the work that they do. They work really long, hard hours and try to make a difference. And it's not always within their purview of what gets tested and what doesn't get tested. My rape kit was never going to be entered into a CODIS system, which is the system in the early 2000s that started to be able to find DNA and identify perpetrators, unless it was put in much, much later. And I don't know the answer to your question about how many specimens. I mean, I know it was a very long exam, and I was at Beth Israel, which was one of the first rape crisis response emergency trained areas in the country. And so they did a really good job. But I just think that you know, I don't know if I want to give away the ending. It's not really a crime mystery, but
Yeah,
but the rape kit was never turned over to the Boston Sexual Assault Unit. It was put in a police officer's locker, and the case was closed 3 weeks after it was started. And so my argument is not so much about what happened to me, but whether things have really changed. And that's what we have to all work towards.
and I'm glad, I wasn't sure if I should go there or not, Michelle, so I'm glad you did.
Yeah.
So Rachel wants to know, as a follow-up question, were your perpetrators ever caught?
No, they weren't. And there's a part in the book where I think we have discovered them, which is really it's a dramatic moment for me, and it's a turning point where somebody who was convicted of rape in 1985 and served 20 years in jail, the minute he gets out of jail, he goes and he breaks into two women's apartment in Boston and disables them in a very similar way to the way I was disabled. And I was like, finally, I'm going to have an answer. I'm going to have closure. And at that point, the Boston Police Department was like, you know what, it's too late. We don't really have a cold case division. It's not going to matter. He's not going to confess. And it was clear to me that they just weren't going to do that. They weren't going to do that work to try to help me have closure. And I found another way to have closure, which is to try to get my message out to a larger group of people about what's happening in our world, and to hopefully work with me to make some change.
Let me take a detour, and then I'll ask the last question.
Okay.
But Kat's question is interesting. You work in universities. She wants to know, how do you feel about the shift during the Obama administration moving to adjudicate sexual assaults?
I think it's really complicated. Most of the students who are sexually assaulted on college campuses do not want to report to law enforcement for a lot of reasons. And they want some semblance of support and accountability. But a lot of schools, you know, I don't think that we should try to be a courtroom because there aren't good systems elsewhere. I do think we have to try to find out if there's some accountability and hold people to that, and whether it's a semester suspension or something more than that. It does matter to victims to feel like the university is trying to do something to enable them to continue their education, which is where Title IX comes in. If somebody's been victimized and they're in a classroom with their perpetrator, by law, that victim needs to be able to continue in that class. And so schools have to figure out how to make that happen in a way that doesn't, can't just be difficult so it's not done. But we're not courts of law. And so I think it's really complicated, but I think that what's happened since the Obama administration has not really served students either, with the changes that Betsy DeVos made. So I think there's still work to be done.
And Michelle, where are we with the backlog of testing rape kits? And can you also briefly talk about something we haven't touched on yet, the statute of limitations? Hopefully I'm saying that right.
Yes.
When it comes to rape charges.
There have been a lot of states that have made changes in laws about, like if you report your rape, you can track its progress in Massachusetts. It doesn't mean it's going to necessarily be go through court if that's what you want, but you can at least know that it's made its way to a crime lab. Some states and cities have changed their laws so that rape kits have to be tested within a certain period of time. So there's legislation that has led to more kits being tested. And there's also been a lot of grants that have gone through to test older kits to try to give some people peace of mind. But there's still a backlog. I say a backlog because it makes it sound like it's just people haven't gotten around to it, and that's not always the case in some states. In terms of statute of limitations, people always ask, why is there a statute of limitations on violent crimes anyway? And I think that's a good question. And one thing they are doing is the Children's Rights Act or something, I'm going to get the name wrong, where they're saying that if you were assaulted as a child, you can bring a charge if you want to. No shame if you don't and can't. But if you want to, you can bring a charge as an adult, and the statute of limitations for your state won't apply. And there's people working on that as well.
All right, Michelle, final question. I think it's very appropriate. It's the purpose, reason you wrote the book. You talk about it throughout the presentation, throughout the book, especially in part 3, which we barely scratched the surface on. But what are the things you would want to see done better in general concerning rape?
I guess I would like to, first of all, ensure, like I was implying about politicians, that rather than minimize the impact, that they follow through on legislation that shows the impact in a real way. I also always say to people, vote locally and vote nationally for people who support justice and dignity for everyone in our society. And that includes people who've been victimized by violent crimes and who are victims of domestic violence and abuse. And I'd like to see us have other methods than just the criminal justice system to support people who've been victims of violence, whether that's more nurses who are trained and doctors in trauma-informed care, holding officers accountable who don't investigate if that's the route somebody wants to go, and also having people talk more about restorative justice and ways to find peace and closure and a return to their own sense of self that aren't relying on people who may not be able to help them. And I know that sounds a little bit esoteric, but I think solutions are sometimes hard to come by, but work, and also not letting things like rape jokes and be something that goes unchallenged, and to raise children to respect each other and not want to harm people in a way that will devastate them for quite a number of years.
Well, Michelle, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. Apologize for going a few minutes over. You did a wonderful job. Folks, please read Michelle's book, which, by the way, just came out in paperback about last month, I guess, Michelle.
Yeah.
And as I said, it's still winning awards and being nominated for awards. It was a very powerful book, certainly changed my thinking on a few things and really opened my eyes on a few other things as well. I'm sure your local library owns a copy, and I'll note that Michelle is donating her time tonight. In exchange, we'll be creating some book club kits for some of the participating libraries, trying to help spread the word of Michelle's wonderful book. Michelle, any last words before we wrap up?
So I just want to say thank you for so many people for listening, for these incredible questions. I saw a couple of my old friends were listening in. I was just delighted to see you. And I just really want to thank you, Robert, and all the libraries who participated. I was hoping somebody would ask me, what was the first book you ever got out of a public library? And I'm going to answer that. It was Harriet the Spy. I almost feel like crying when I say it. I loved that book. And I loved that I could go to the library with my little card and get a book and be entrusted with it. And I loved it. And we owe people who work in libraries so much. And so I just feel as an author so blessed to have all of you. And thank you all so much for listening and your kind comments. And thank you. I hope to see some of you in person sometime. So
yeah, thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you, everyone. For those watching live, look for that email from tomorrow morning from me. Everyone have a great rest of their night. Thanks again, Michelle.
Thank you. Take care. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.